again and doing it really well, is pretty much the hormones of stress. And stress is when your body is knocked out of homeostasis. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. And we have three basic stresses. We have physical stress like accidents, injuries, falls, traumas. We have chemical stress like bacteria and viruses and hormones and foods and heavy metals and hangovers and blood sugar levels. And then we have emotional stress, and that's family tragedies, loss, job, finances. And all of those things knock our brain and body out of balance. All organisms in nature can tolerate short-term stress. A pack of coyotes chases a deer. If the deer outruns the coyotes, 15 minutes later she turns back into grazing. She goes back into foraging and grazing, and the stress response is over. But human beings, we're so unique because we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. We could think about something that's happened in our past, or we can worry about something that's going to happen in the future. And by thought alone, we turn on those same chemicals. And when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for some type of disease, because no organism in nature can live in emergency mode for an extended period of time. So, to answer your question, if you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and it's a scientific fact that the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease, then it means that your thoughts can literally make you sick. So the fundamental question is, if your thoughts can make you sick, is it possible that your thoughts can make you well?
Can you explain what meditation does and what happens in the mind and brain?
Sure. So the word meditation literally means to become familiar with. So here's the old self, and here's the new self. And it's not like we just waltz over to the new self in a matter of days. We have to go through this transformation that takes place. And if 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of subconscious behaviors, automatic habits, emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, and attitudes that function like a computer program, that's 95% of who we are, where the body has been programmed to become the mind. That's what a habit is. And we're going to begin to change with the 5% of our conscious mind. You can imagine that you can think positively all you want, but if you feel negatively, because you've been feeling that way for the last 30 years, mind and body are in opposition. You could create the most fabulous dream board in the world with all the things you want in your life, but if you feel unworthy, that's mind and body in opposition. The idea then is to recondition the body to a new mind. So here's the old self and here's the new self. And you're going to embark on change. The moment you decide to no longer think a certain way, to act a certain way, or to feel a certain way, you are going to step into this river of change. Because the hardest part about change is not making the same choice as you did the day before. So we think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that we think in one day, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. Now, the same thoughts always lead to the same choices. The same choices always lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors create the same experiences, and the same experiences produce the same emotions. And those emotions drive our very same thoughts. And our biology, our neurocircuitry, our neurochemistry, our neurohormones, and even our genetic expression stays exactly the same. So now, there's a principle in neuroscience that says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. If you keep thinking the same way, keep making the same choices, keep demonstrating the same behaviors, keep reproducing the same experiences that stamp the same networks of neurons into the same patterns, all for the familiar feeling that you've grown accustomed to called you, then you begin to hardwire your brain into a very finite signature. And that finite signature becomes our identity, almost like a box in the brain. There's no literal box in the brain, but it's the most commonly fired, neurologically wired set of thoughts, behaviors, and emotions that's acquired through frequent repetition. So how you think, how you act, and how you feel is called your personality. And your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. So then, if you wanted to create a new personal reality, a new life, you'd have to change your personality, which means you'd have to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. You'd have to become aware of your unconscious habits and behaviors and even what you say and modify them. And then you'd have to look at those emotions that keep you anchored to the past and decide if those emotions belong in your future. So most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become someone else. So the word meditation then means to become familiar with. So if you're sitting in a meditation and you're observing the thoughts that have been going on behind the scenes of your awareness because you've been too distracted by your external environment, and now you're becoming conscious of your unconscious thoughts, and they're becoming familiar to you, now you're in a meditation to know thyself. If you're becoming aware of your propensities and your urges, and the body wanting to get up and do things, and you're making it sit there and stay, and you are telling it it's no longer the mind, that you are the mind, and you're becoming conscious of those unconscious behaviors, and they're becoming familiar to you, well, now you're in a meditation to know thyself. And if you can look at the emotions that bring you to a lower denominator and notice them and not begin to experience them, but to observe them, the very act of observation means that you are no longer the program. You're the consciousness now observing the program, and you're beginning to objectify your subjective self. You are looking at yourself through the eyes of someone else, which means now you're no longer the old self. You're pure consciousness observing the old self. That's the first step in the meditative process. We have to light a match in a dark place and become so aware of how unaware we've been that we don't let any thought, any behavior, any emotion slip by our awareness unchecked. So then, if you're sitting in a meditation and you say, what is compassion? What is a better way to be in my life? How can I turn my life around? How can I feel better about myself? And you begin to think about what thoughts you do want to fire and wire in your brain. You begin to review the behaviors of how you are going to live in this new life. The act of rehearsing them mentally begins to change the brain from living in the past to living in the future. In other words, mental rehearsal is going to cause the brain to look like that experience has already occurred. So now your brain has a new installation of hardware. That's priming the brain for the future. If you do that enough times, over and over again, nerve cells that fire together, wire together, it'll begin to become familiar to you. And if you can cultivate the elevated emotion before the experience, in other words, the materialist, the person who's waiting for their wealth to come to feel abundance, they're living by that model of cause and effect. But the quantum model is about causing an effect, which means you begin to experience your own worthiness and your abundance before it occurs. If you can begin to reproduce that elevated emotion, or even healing or wholeness, when you reach that point where you're able to cultivate that emotion over and over again, it'll begin to become familiar to you. So the process of change in the meditative model requires unlearning and relearning. It requires breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. What we say in neuroscience, pruning synaptic connections and sprouting new connections, unfiring and unwiring and refiring and rewiring, unmemorizing emotions that are stored in the body and then reconditioning the body to a new mind and to a new emotion, no longer signaling the same genes in the same way, but signaling new genes in new ways. Beginning to pull your energy out of the past and beginning to invest your energy into the future. So we use the model of meditation because it's important for people to disconnect from their external environment. If you close your eyes and you eliminate all the distractions from your outer world, the people and things and places, all of a sudden your brain waves are going to begin to change. And you're going to have less attention on your outer world. And if you're seeing less and you're hearing less, and we play soft music in the background, you'll begin to pay attention to more of what you're thinking and less about what's going on in your life. If you sit your body down and you train it to be in one place without doing anything and experiencing the same events to create the same emotions, you're telling your body that it's no longer the mind, that you are the mind. And if you are no longer thinking about the predictable future or the familiar past, and you are present in the moment, that's the moment your inner world starts to become more real than the outer world. And that's the moment you can begin to make substantial changes in your own personal physiology. So the research that we've done, and we've measured over 3,500 brains in meditation, and I can tell you that without a doubt, that you're at your absolute best when you forget about yourself, when you get beyond yourself, when you become nobody, no one, no thing, nowhere, and no time. That's the moment you become pure consciousness. And that's the moment you're no longer living as a body in the environment and time. And consciousness is what actually executes and has the ability to change the brain and body in very unique ways. Now, we already know how to do this. It's just making it a skill. So then people spend the majority of their lives hoping and wishing and wanting and praying that there'll be some type of change within them. But what we're teaching people how to do is not to pray to have their prayers answered, but to get up from their meditations as if their prayers are already answered. Because when they're combining that clear intention of their future with that elevated emotion, they're literally changing their energy, they're changing their brain chemistry, they're changing the way their brain works, they're changing their genetic expression, they're changing their chemistry. They're literally becoming somebody else. And over again, when people do this, it may take them months to turn their disease around. But over and over again, we've seen this. They come back to a certain level of awareness, and the disease is no longer there. And it's almost like the disease existed in the old personality. They're literally someone else. And we've seen it enough times now to know that people reach a certain point with themselves where they feel so whole. They feel so satisfied with who they are. They feel so happy with themselves and their lives that they could care less if they have the disease. And that's the moment it goes away over and over again. So the other thing about meditation that's so important is that the purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind. Now, what separates the conscious mind from the subconscious mind is the analytical mind. And when we're driven by the hormones of stress, the very cocktail of chemicals that are created from those stress responses begin to cause our brains to become overly analytical. So the problem that most people have is that the moment they're in an emotional reaction, they tend to analyze their life within that emotion. And since that emotion is a record of the past, and the stress hormones are causing you to believe that your outer world is more real than your inner world, it drives the brain further out of balance. And so when you're under stress, you're focusing on objects. You're narrowing your focus on things, on people, on your environment, because that's where the danger is. You're preoccupied with your body because you believe that you're your body when you're under stress, because in antiquity you had to survive by taking care of your body. And you're preoccupied with time. So living by the hormones of stress causes us to focus on three things: the environment, our body, and time. And we begin to become materialists, and we define reality with our senses. So as we narrow our focus on things and objects, and we begin to believe the outer world is more real than the inner world, and we're trying to predict the future based on the past, we get in trouble because the brain gets more and more out of balance. So when the brain is receiving all these chemicals, it moves into a super aroused state. And that super aroused state then becomes common for most people, but it's like driving their sports car in first gear on the freeway. They stay in the state for extended periods of time. So then, when your focus is narrowed in objects and things and people, the danger is that the brain gets locked into this high state, super aroused state, and begins to become very conditioned into believing that what's in front of it is the real world. So why would you take your attention off of your external environment if there's a predator around the corner? Why would you open your heart and trust if you knew that there was danger there? Why would you want to learn when you should be running or fighting or hiding? And more than 70% of the time in the Western world, people spend the majority of their time living in stress. So it's the redundancy of that process that causes different networks of neurons to begin to compartmentalize. They begin to subdivide. And as the brain begins to become incoherent and begins to become out of balance, when our brain is incoherent, we're incoherent. And when our brain isn't working right, we're not working right. At the same time, the heart, which has its own little brain in it and its own little intelligence, begins to function incoherently as well. And the effect of that is it begins to send very aberrant signals to the body. So then in meditation, when you disconnect from your environment, when you get beyond your body and you transcend linear time, and the inner world starts becoming more real than your outer world, the moment you forget that you're a name, that you're a gender, that you're a wardrobe, that you're a social security number, that you're a profession, that you're married, that you're single, that you're a vegetarian, the moment that you forget about who you are, your identity, your body, the things you own, the place you live, the place you're sitting, and you forget about time, all of a sudden, it's almost like the ego, the personality, is vacant. And when that occurs, all of a sudden, different compartments of the brain that were once subdivided begin to synchronize. We've measured this over and over again. And what syncs in the brain begins to link in the brain. So as different compartments and communities of neurons and neighborhoods of neurons begin to organize into coherence, into orderliness, you start feeling more whole and more like yourself. At the same exact time that we've seen this occur, all the energy that's sitting in the survival centers begins to move right up into the heart, and the person begins to fall in love with the moment. They feel connected to something greater. When we live by the hormones of stress and we're determining our reality with our senses as materialists, we experience separation from possibility. We think we're separate from everything. We're living in a realm where we're defining reality with our senses, and if we can't see it or smell it or taste it or feel it, it doesn't exist. That's what those chemicals do. But when the energy moves into the heart, it begins to produce a profound magnetic field. When you're living by the chemicals of stress, you're drawing from this vital field around your body, and it's turning into chemistry, and the field around your body begins to shrink. We've measured this, and now you become more matter and less energy, more particle and less wave. Now, this is the problem. When people are matter, trying to change matter in their life, and it takes a certain amount of time to get what they want because they have to drag their body through space over and over again to finally reach their goals. They try to force the outcome. They try to predict the outcome. They try to control the outcome because instinctively they're matter trying to produce an effect in matter. When that energy moves into the center and the field around your body begins to expand, you're no longer taking from the field, you are now contributing to the field. When that heart starts to get coherent and starts getting rhythmic and starts getting organized, it's like dropping a pebble in water. It's producing a wave. And if you can sustain this state, you're dropping pebble after pebble after pebble, and it's creating waves that keep going out. You're sending a signal out into the field. if you can feel profoundly and deeply, if you can feel richly, you're dropping bigger stones in the water and they're producing bigger waves. Now, all energy is frequency, and all frequency carries information. And if you had the intent of whatever it is that you wanted to be carried on that wave of energy, that elevated emotion, you would begin to broadcast a new signature into the field. And whatever you broadcast into the field is your experiment with destiny. And the longer your consciousness can linger in that energy, now you are calling your future to you. You are collapsing time, and space is moving towards you because you're creating from a realm beyond matter. You're more energy than matter in this realm. And when that occurs, when the brain is coherent and the heart is coherent, as the heart gets more organized and feels more coherent, it sends a profound signal to the brain. We analyze less, we trust more. We would never try to force the outcome or control the outcome. We trust the outcome because we feel connected to something greater. That state of being can be taught, and it can be sustained, and it can become a skill. And if you're able to regulate those states every single day, and able to get your brain and body working right before you present yourself out into the world, you'll be less likely to react to the people and conditions in your life. You'll less likely have your old habits and emotional reactions run who you are. And you'll less likely be thinking about the same predictable future or the familiar past because you'll be present in the moment. And that is when, that elegant state is when the miraculous and the uncommon begins to occur. And we've seen this in our workshops around the world where we've measured people's brains during meditation and their hearts. It is one of the most magical things you'll ever see. We can be looking at a monitor of a person's brain in real time during a meditation. And we're getting so good at this now because we can predict when it's going to happen. We'll see these little downloads from the field, ba-boom, ba-boom, and we start seeing them, we know something amazing is going to happen. And if we can look at a three-dimensional picture of the brain, all of a sudden we see the front of the brain talking to the back of the brain. We see the right side of the brain talking to the left side of the brain. We see different compartments of the brain beginning to synchronize. And when we start seeing that, we know that person is about ready to move into a whole brain state. The union of polarities is love. The two hemispheres coming together, the polarities, the duality of the two hemispheres uniting as one is love. It's when we start having that energy land right here, the center of oneness, the center of wholeness. The brain gets organized, the heart gets organized, and when we see that occurring, we can walk around and look at that person, and there are tears of joy running down their face because they are connected to something greater. And that intelligence that's giving us life, that's keeping our heart beating and digesting our food, that runs through the autonomic nervous system, it is the greatest healer in the world. All we have to do is get out of the way. And when we get out of the way, the operator, the tormentor, the personality who's instructing the body to stay in its limited states, once you're nobody, no one, no thing, nowhere, and no time, and the operator's gone, the autonomic nervous system begins to create order where there's disorder. It begins to do what it can do so well, which is create homeostasis and balance. It can begin to change chemistry. It can begin to change genes. It could begin to change neurological patterns. It could begin to move energy in the body. And the person always says the same thing. I didn't do any of the healing. It was the power within me that did the healing all along. All I had to do was just get out of the way. And so I think that we could only talk around these things, that you have to have the experience.